Welcome to Next Round with the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Rowena Itchon. In this podcast, Tim Anaya, PRI Senior Director of Communications, and I chat with Adam Andrzejewski, founder of Open the Books, an organization dedicated to transparency in government. Open the Books has been at the forefront of holding state government accountable for how it spends the people's money. In California, Governor Newsom's most recent state budget plan proposed $222 billion in general fund spending alone. So when State Controller Betty Yee declined to Open the Books' request for line-by-line state spending, they sued her in court to force her to reveal these public spending records. We chat with Adam about his case against California and the victories they've won in other states for holding public officials accountable. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to Next Round, Adam.
Great.
Well, we're so happy to have you on to talk about your efforts to make government more open and accessible here in California. But, before we start, for our listeners who may not be familiar with Open the Books, tell us a little bit about your organization and some of the work that you do.
Well, openthebooks.com, we are the strongest voice in America for robust transparency and adversarial, what we call forensic auditing, just across the country. So our first mission is to capture government spending. And we've been successful capturing the world's largest private database of public sector expenditures. We've captured 5 billion individual spending transactions at the federal, state, and local level across the country. So, Rowena, our federal database is comprised of the federal checkbook all the way back to 2001. We've captured 49 out of 50 state checkbooks, many of those going back a dozen years. California actually is the only holdout. We have not been able to get the state checkbook out of California, which we'll talk about today. At the local level, we've built something that's unique. For the first time in the history of the country, we've captured virtually every single public employee, their salary and pension record at every level of government across the entire country. In 60,000 substantial public bodies, we filed a request to get their public employee salaries and pensions. People listening to the program might have seen in the Wall Street Journal and USA Today our open letter to President Trump, encouraging the president as commander-in-chief to embrace the transparency revolution and to wage war on waste, to protect the American taxpayer from waste, fraud, corruption, and taxpayer abuse. And we published that letter with 100 examples of outrageous federal taxpayer abuse. And one of those examples was in California. It was $1.4 million that went on a grant from Health and Human Services to an organization in California to teach California prostitutes sex education. Look, it's a target-rich environment.
Oh, no.
At the state level in California last summer, many people listening to the podcast will remember that San Francisco had the poop map. We're the organization that created that. We took 118,000 instances of human waste in the public way, and we mapped each one of those with latitude and longitude coordinates. Let me tell you, there is a brownout in the Bay Area. The whole city was brown.
Adam, as you mentioned and, just gave that kind of crazy example, California is home to excessive state spending. And the governor's most recent budget proposed $222 billion in general fund spending alone. And that's why, Open the Books really plays such an important role at the forefront of holding elected officials and bureaucrats accountable for how they spend the people's money. Now, as you noted, the state's program to do this is really lacking, and it's been harshly criticized, not just by you guys, but also by the nonpartisan state auditor, and it really has little to show for itself, even though we've spent $1 billion in public funds trying to be more open and accountable. So maybe to start out with, could you describe for our listeners what public spending information is currently available today in California? The goal of this, and I love the name of this, some consultant must have come up with this name, the fiscal with a $sign system. And how does California compare with other states for the availability of this financial information online?
Well, we give California an F, the state government an F in transparency. Every single year for the past 7 years, our auditors at openthebooks.com have filed a request with all 50 states to simply procure the line-by-line spending transactions of those states. It's probably the most important record in the state, Tim, if you think about it, where your money went. And we have been successful in 49 out of 50 states, and California has rejected our request for the state checkbook. So it's got this financial system called fiscal, as you mentioned. State taxpayers since 2005 have poured an incredible amount of money into it. It's $1.1 billion that system has cost. Nevertheless, the goal of the system was supposed to be, one state, one system, and it still can't produce a state checkbook. It's absolutely pretty incredible.
So, California, the home of Silicon Valley, you would think that our state would be technologically superior when it comes to public transparency and how our tax dollars are spent. Since most every other state, as you say, provides some level of public spending information online, just how difficult is it for California to create an easy access online spending portal? I suspect, Adam, that the reason why California can't do it is that its systems are a mess. What are your thoughts on this?
So I think the systems, probably are a mess, but being a mess or being embarrassed because they're a mess is not a statutory exemption under California open records law to deny our request. So they're going to have to get their systems in line. Look, even if Fiscal was 100% operational, it still would only publish 2/3 of all state spending transactions online. Let's break that down. There's 10 state agencies that have legacy systems that would first come onto Fiscal over the course of the next decade. There are 10 major systems, including the colleges and universities. The state legislature has exempted themselves, the teacher retirement system, CalPERS, big systems like that are exempted forever. They'll never come on to Fiscal. So let's just say after $1 billion of taxpayer funding, this accounting system, even if it was perfectly operational, and it's not, it would still only be able to provide 2/3 of the state checkbook.
So you made news recently when State Controller Betty Yee, as you mentioned, declined your Public Records Act request for this line-by-line spending, and you actually took her to court to force her to reveal these public spending records. So tell us a little bit about your lawsuit, the information that you're seeking in it, and how you rate your chances of victory in court.
Well, we're going to win. So first off, our lawyers are Cause of Action Institute out of Washington, D.C. And I want to laud these aggressive attorneys because we looked for 2 years for legal representation in California. And we really struggled to find the right fit. And we're very happy with Cause of Action. They represent us. We've got local counsel in Sacramento. We've got a very, very strong case. It's a writ of mandate asking the judge to issue an order for the State Controller Betty Yee to produce the state checkbook. Nobody's arguing, even Betty Yee, nobody's arguing there's an exemption where she doesn't have to publish the line-by-line transactions, that she doesn't have to produce a copy of that. It's statutory. Obviously, public spending information should be posted publicly, period. So we're on great legal footing, but it's always a dogfight. And we're up for that fight. This is not the first lawsuit. We had to sue Illinois back in 2012. There was a Republican comptroller, Judy Bartopinka. She also claimed, embarrassingly, that the state of Illinois books were a mess, that they had all these legacy systems, and she couldn't produce the line-by-line transactions. Well, she got religion after we sued her. Within 9 months, they were able to produce 7 years. In 2018, we sued Republican state auditor in Wyoming, Cynthia Cloud. Again, she said that they just couldn't get it done. We noticed they spent $64 million on an accounting system. We called that company. They said they could produce a state checkbook. When a new auditor came in 7 months later, she produced 5 years of line-by-line spending to us in her first 30 days on the job. This is not a question of whether they can do it. We believe they can. This is simply a question of political will. They're testing our will and our wallet, and with Cause of Action, we're serious, and we're serious to break open the checkbook in California.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you were forced to go to court when there's already quite a bit of information available out there through the state controller's website. What do you think is behind blocking your request? I mean, they're saying it's workload and manpower, but what are they really hiding? What do you think?
So I think one of the things that we'll be able to fact check is whether the controller herself is actually doing her job. So for every single bill that she cuts, every single warrant that she pays, that's an affidavit attesting to the fact that she believes the payment is proper, that there isn't waste, fraud, corruption, or abuse in that payment. Now, we noticed on her website that since she took office in 2015, she's actually flagged about $4 billion worth of payment. And it sounds like a lot of money, until you consider the fact that during that period, the state of California, she paid $1.5 trillion worth of bills. Betty Yee is probably the only one out of 40 million Californians who believes that 99.7% of all state spending has been proper. Nobody believes that. She's just not doing her job. We're going to be able to fact check that. We're going to be able to follow the money. This is why this record is so important.
Adam, what's been the response from other state and local officials in California to your lawsuit? Is anybody publicly supporting your efforts to make this information more readily accessible, or do a lot of them fear the public finding out about some of the questionable spending practices they'd rather they didn't know about?
So we've had really good media coverage. The politicians across the continuum have been silent on it. We've seen no response from Democrats or Republicans from any elected official at any level in California. However, the columnist at Cal Matters, distributed in about 30 or 40 California newspapers, his name's Dan Walters, he wrote a great piece lauding our work. This was published across California, so we got good press on that. Nationally, up at Forbes, I'm a senior policy contributor, and we wrote a popular piece with tens of thousands of page views on the subject. It was picked up by Hot Air and also by Zero Hedge and the Washington Free Beacon. So we've gotten good media coverage on it, with a lot more to come. We actually forced the Controller Betty Yee to respond to this media coverage. She put up a very derisive 200-word letter up at Cal Matters. She basically argued that she didn't deny the request, that we didn't clarify the request, and that we were hard to work with. And each one of those points is false. So first of all, when you say you can't or won't fulfill our request, and we have that in writing, and you also admit that you cut 49 million individual bills last year, you turn over zero of those transactions to us, that's a denial. She was the party that went silent. I'll briefly walk you through the timeline. It took her 11 weeks even to acknowledge our request. During that period, we asked for 2 status updates with certified letters. After she denied the request, within 72 hours, we clarified our request. Then we waited 2 months. We heard nothing from her office. We were hoping she would produce the line-by-line spending, and then we filed our lawsuit. The next time we heard from her was up at Cal Matters with this 200-word letter saying that we were the unresponsive party, and it's obviously prima facie just not true.
Well, Governor Newsom and other public officials in California have also spoken out about making government more transparent, yet not much has been done about it. Do you think this is a case of politicians just paying lip service when they don't really believe in transparency? Or is it the case that California's deep state is throwing up roadblocks to stall government from reform efforts?
Well, I think it's a classic case. And look, Newsom just, he's got a moment, he can embrace this reform moment. But here's our experience typically with politicians. They'll run on transparency, and then when they get elected to office, they run away from it. So we're going to bring the heat so they see the light. Here's what we would, one of the first things we would do with the California state checkbook, and this probably sends shivers up their spine. We would take the state vendor list, who received how much money last year, and we would run that against Governor Newsom's campaign donor disclosures. Now, we did that a little bit north up in Oregon, and Governor Kate Brown in the run-up to her reelection in 2018. And here's what we found. We found that she had a pattern of soliciting state vendors for campaign cash. Now, in Oregon, this was completely legal. We found 557 vendors gave Kate Brown's campaign $2.6 million. And those 500 vendors had reaped $4.4 billion in state payment. We would like to do this in the state of California. When the comptroller doesn't provide the state checkbook, that forestalls oversight.
Let's talk a little bit about some of your other efforts to make government spending data more open and accessible to taxpayers. A couple of years back, I know that PRI was pleased to partner with Open the Books in producing a California pension chart book, which showed that the state's pension crisis stood at closer to $1 trillion if you used a more honest accounting method. And for our listeners, if you're interested in downloading that chart book, you can go to our website at pacificresearch.org. So, Adam, now that a greater light has been shined on our runaway pension problems, thanks to your efforts, are you seeing politicians across the country thinking twice now before agreeing to sweetheart pension deals now that the public is watching how they're spending?
We do. And we believe that the open government movement is revolutionizing United States public policy and politics. And everybody has a role to play. As a public charity, an IRS-recognized 501c3 organization like you guys, we have an educational role. We play that very well. There's other swim lanes that good people that must insist on reform need to play. And one of those are challengers to the incumbent political class, because good policy that we all outline is also good politics, and people need to run on these things. In our home state of Illinois, we're actually headquartered. We're based in Illinois. It is the Super Bowl of corruption, and we've actually seen big success with people running on good government reforms. For example, because of our exposure of salaries and excessive pensions in Illinois, there was a local school superintendent. He's got less than 100 kids in his district, one building, 11 teachers. He was making $206,000 a year. He was also retired as a police chief from a different village on a $70,000 a year pension. He was also receiving a stipend as a local mayor, and he was on the local railroad board for even more money. And he had to drop out of a state representative race. He was trying to move up to state rep because of our exposure. Look, at my own junior college a couple of years ago, we found that the college spent $100 million that they didn't even disclose on a line-by-line basis to the public, the press, or even their own board of trustees. Only the president of the school and the chairman of the board knew the details. We found that the tens of thousands of dollars of country club dues of the president was paid through that imprest account. We found that when he went to Botswana and slaughtered an African elephant, that thousands of dollars paid for his global satellite phones. We found that they opened up a French restaurant, complete with a world-class wine cellar, and hired a French sommelier. And when we exposed all this, a new school board of trustees was elected. They cut student tuition. They cut property taxes. They fired the president, the treasurer, and the comptroller of the school. And there was a new day at the school. And so that's the type of thing that we're seeing with robust exposure of malfeasance.
That's really great work. That's fantastic. Congratulations on that. Let's turn to pensions and salaries. You've also been a pioneer in making salary and pension data about government workers in California and across the country available online. Now, when I was in my youth, when I was in my 20s and working for the federal government, I'm making $25,000 a year. And I was appalled that the whole world would know my salary, given the fact that so many of my friends who were engineers made twice as much money as I did. Make the case why it's important that this information is available to taxpayers. And what do you ultimately learn when we see so many state and local employees who are making far more in salary and pension than their private sector counterparts could ever dream of these days?
So first off, I just want to cover the transparency aspect. Public employees' salaries must be made available publicly, because when you're a public employee, you work for the taxpayer. You're paid by the taxpayer, and that gives the taxpayer license to see where their dollars were spent. And so it's highly critical that we have names of public employees, job titles, and total compensation figures on that record. Look, I think what we learn when we look at $100,000 pension club of public employees is that quite evidently these systems are unsustainable. And at the levels of pay, pension, and perk, it's the number one public policy issue that we argue, whether you're dealing with education or health and welfare or public safety, police, fire. All these government services, they're heavily dependent, these budgets, on the levels of pay, perquisites, and pensions. So everything has to be on the table so we can gainfully debate what's needed in terms of the delivery mechanism of these services. And it opened the books. I want to invite everybody listening to the podcast, come to our website. We've got 24 million public employees. It's virtually everybody employed by government at every level of government across the country. In California, you can see the 400,000 public employee salaries that are in excess of $100,000. You can see the 50,000 public employees who are retired on a six-figure public pension. You can see, that lifeguards in LA County County make over $300,000 a year with overtime, and they get a sunscreen allowance on top of it.
So finally, with PRI so close to wine country, we love nothing more than sharing a glass of wine or other adult beverage while discussing public policy, and in our case here, lamenting how many members of the 100,000 Club are in California. So when you're trying to unwind after reviewing the latest batch of out-of-control government spending data, what wine, beer, adult, or otherwise beverage do you enjoy?
Just a glass of Merlot. And if I'm with you guys, since you're near wine country, I'd love to do it. I hope you're enjoying this in your own personal wine cave. I'm a marathon runner. Red wine, it's supposed to be heart healthy. We'll go with Merlot.
Do you have a favorite?
Anything that's served, that's the house wine of the restaurant that I'm in.
Thanks so much, Adam.
Thank you. Thanks for your interest in our work.
Special thanks to Adam Andrzejewski from Open the Books. To learn more about their work, go to openthebooks.com. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Please join us again for Next Round with PRI.